Howdy, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. Today, we're going to kick off what's bound to be a pretty long series. I like to think of it as a continuation of my Atlantis Lemuria series. I had mentioned several times throughout those episodes that I would be considering Mexico, the Yucatan, Central America, America in general, as kind of the next chapter in that story. So I didn't really know where to start, and I thought this was a perfect place. It'll kind of tie in nicely with some of my Anomalous America episodes, which we'll talk about a little bit as we go through this. And we'll share some of my posts from a few years ago on Twitter um, that correlate quite nicely. So, yeah, without wasting any time, let's just get right into the article. And as always, thanks for tuning in. Hope you're enjoying the material. This is from the El Paso Herald, 1912. The Tower of Babel built by ancient Mexicans. Why science now believes that the mysterious Mayas of the Yucatan came from ancient Babylon after the confusion of tongues. And I'll just read the captions on the images here. The confusion of tongues, Dora's conception of the curious skyscraping Tower of Babel, whose destruction is recorded in the 11th chapter of Genesis. It is a type of many Babylonian buildings. Here in the center, this sculptured king on a Mayan temple at Chichen Itza, Yucatan, resembles in detail the sculptured kings on the temple of Nebuchadnezzar at Babylon. And finally, here at the bottom, the pyramid tower of the sun at Tenochtitlan, Mexico, showing its extraordinary resemblance to the Tower of Babel and other similar buildings in Babylonia as reconstructed from their ruins. Like I said, 1912 El Paso. I'm going to jump right in down here. The towers and pyramids built by the Mayans, the ancient civilized inhabitants of Mexico, who flourished before the Aztecs, are the greatest wonders of antiquity in America. An interesting theory now strongly held by scientists. Here, let me zoom in a little bit more, sorry. And it's not all grainy, perfect. An interesting theory now strongly held by scientists and scholars of the Smithsonian Institution is that the Mayans are descended from the ancient people of Babylon, who were dispersed over the face of the earth after the capture of the famous city by Cyrus. And if this be so, then the ancient Mayas built the Tower of Babel of the Bible, and those early inhabitants of the earth were, in a sense, Americans. Now, you've heard through many of my videos talking about so much of my Anomalous America episodes correlate with the many of the stories of the Bible taking place here in America, America being much older, if not the oldest inhabited area in the realm, and that all along the Mississippi Valley um, and up into Canada were parts of Canaan and Babylon and so on and so forth. And so when they say here, the ancient Mayans built the Tower of Babel of the Bible, and those early inhabitants of the earth were, in a sense, Americans. Uh, is a very powerful sentence. And we'll relate some of my other presentations to kind of corroborate this. This view is confirmed in a great degree by the extraordinary resemblance between the ruined towers and pyramids of Babylonia and those built by the Mayans in the Yucatan. In In addition to this, there is other evidence that the Mayas came from somewhere in Asia. Now, when I talk about the Olmecs and the early history of China, you've heard this correlation with me several times, in that I believe historically the Olmec and the Maya were one and the same, and perhaps the Mayas were, in a sense, kind of muddied. Their history was muddied, and as were the Olmec, right? The Olmec probably being the most so, because their history is so shrouded in mystery. Although um, they called themselves the Z, and when you look at the earliest dynasties of China, they correlate quite um, poetically with the Olmec histories, and that I don't believe these people came from Asia. I believe they peopled they peopled Asia, and that Babylonia was here in the Americas. So again, the importance of that sentence that I stated earlier, that the Mayans were perhaps the first Americans, and by that we were also talking about the Olmecs, because were the Olmecs the first Chinese? Seems seems very probable as well. Again, I've done some video correlations with the symbology of the pagoda, tree worship, towers, Babylon, the Tower of Babel, what the pagoda symbolized, the tree of life, Yggdrasil tree. The symbologies overlap quite nicely between all these different cultures. Where was I? The Tower of Babel was the largest of many a similar structure of pyramidal shape in Babylon, which were crowned with temples. But where the ancient Assyrians constructed scores of such terraced towers, the Mayans built thousands, many of them of huge size and of substantially the same pattern. Now, again, not to get off subject, but why I wanted to correlate this with the Atlantis Lemurian thing. In further episodes, we're going to get back into Queen Mu and the idea that she took this technology to the Middle East, quote, Middle East, and that she took the Fertile Crescent, the true Fertile Crescent of the Gulf of Mexico with her, citrus fruit, all construction, all these things. And she was welcomed with open arms in Egypt, and where she established the same type of culture that she brought with her from the Yucatan. According to the Mayan legends, Zalhuk, one of the seven giants who survived the deluge, erected a pyramidal tower of enormous height for the purpose of storming heaven. But the offended gods destroyed it with lightnings and confounded the languages of the builders. This evidently gives strong confirmation to the theory that the prehistoric inhabitants of the Yucatan brought the tradition of the tower and the story of the flood with them from Assyria. Certainly nobody anywhere else in the world, save the ancient Assyrians and Babylonians, ever built temple covered towers like those found today in the ruins all over the Yucatan. While pursuing the same architectural method, the Mayans far outdid the Babylonians in pyramidal building. Sometimes they shaped and terraced whole hills to serve as supports for temples or groups of shrines, adding course of stone in such a way to give increased height and symmetry. The temple at the top usually had a special enclosure, which was the place of sacrifice where human victims were offered up. The pyramids of Yucatan are square or rectangular in shape. Some are nearly 100 feet high, and the largest is over 500 feet square. They have sloping sides, some nearly vertical, and many rise in steps, faced with stone, dressed smooth or plastered and embellished with sculptures. I apologize. They were ascended by steep stairways on one or more sides. The interior masses of earth and stone, or stones of the mortar. In some cases, the slopes were filled in it to a smooth slant. The loftiest is the pyramid of El Castillo, or the castle, or at Chichen Itza, which is of the step type. The largest and most imposing is the so-called governor's palace at Uxmal. Now we're going to dive into Uxmal here later in the series as well. And we're going to bring it all kind of back to who built Uxmal and why it has so many Etruscan overlays and why on the Pyramid of the Sun and Moon they find, quote, ancient Chinese symbols. Again, as I was stating earlier, that the Maya or Olmec or Z took their language to China, and that China of today, although, well, China of today was confounded and destroyed in the 1800s, as many languages have had letters, words, things replaced. Well, the languages have been muddied again since this confusion of tongues, purposely, of course, to erase some of this history. And we'll share some of that evidence going further and further. But what's really going to get interesting is what we find even layer upon layer underneath some of these temples. But Uxmal is really important, and we'll bring the Etruscan narrative into the wrap it all up nicely with the Aztec, Atlantis, Lemuria, Queen Mu concepts, which stands on a natural elevation artificially heightened by stone blocks and rising in three terraces. It is considered by ethnologists the most important prehistoric structure in America. The building, 320 feet long, 40 feet deep, and 26 feet high, is covered with a marvelous elaboration of sculpture, one belt of which, 10 feet wide, running entirely around the palace, contains 20,000 stones, nearly every one of them a separate work of art. Nobody knows for what purpose this wonderful building was used, but it seems to have been erected merely as one side of a contemplated quadrangular edifice. As for El Castillo, it was a pyramid temple of the first order. The square pyramid is 80 feet high, 200 feet square at the base, and 60 feet square at the top. The step sides rise at an angle of 50 degrees. The platform at the top is reached by four stairways, and the surface was evened with plaster and finished with color. Now, again, going back through my anomalous series, we find temples like this all the way up the Mississippi Valley. We're not talking about mounds, we're talking about temples just like this. And as I've stated before, many of the mounds, St. Louis, all the way into Ohio, aren't just irregular shaped stone. They're beautifully cut, perfectly cut stone with almost identical proportions to this. And if we look at their own myth, their own creation stories, and their own migration stories, they themselves say they came from the north or the northwest, even. I think up along the Mississippi into Canada and into the northwest from um, the American Southwest, even. Each stairway had 92 steps, which were guarded by balustrades in the form of huge sculptured serpents whose heads and protruding tongues rested upon the ground while their bodies and tails extended upward to the top of the pyramid. Babel was a name of Babylon. In the book of Genesis, 11th chapter, will be found the story of how the survivors of mankind after the deluge traveled from the mountain where the ark rested and settled in the valley of Shinar. There, they built a city and finally attempted to construct a tower whose top should reach heaven. Yahweh, in his abode on high, became angered and said, let us go down and confound their language. Then the Babylonians were scattered abroad over the face of the earth, as it says in Genesis. They left off building the city. Thus, the diversity of human speech and dispersion of mankind were explained. The Tower of Babel was a small affair in height compared with a modern skyscraper. It was only about 140 feet high, but the dwellers of the Assyrian plain, where they were no lofty objects for comparison, it seemed to touch the heavens. Standing on the high artificial terrace, like other important Babylonian edifices, it was further uplifted by a second platform of earth, 600 feet square. Excuse me. Thus, its total height above the ground level may have been something like 250 feet. It was a pyramid of 7 steps, sacred to Marduk, the great god of Babylon. The first story was 272 feet square, faced with glazed brick and painted black in honor of Saturn. To Jupiter, the second story was dedicated, and the color belonging to the god being orange. It was of the tint 220 feet on a side. The color of the third story was red, in complement to Mars, each of its side 184 feet. The fourth story was 148 feet square and was covered with thick plates of gold, being dedicated to the sun. White was the hue of the fifth story, out of respect for Venus, and it was 122 feet square. The sixth story was blue, Mercury's color, and each of its sides measured 70 feet. A cube of 15 feet formed the seventh story and was covered with plates of silver in honor of the moon. Marduk was the god of light. In the beginning of things, he battled with the dragon of chaos. And the effect, the capture of that frightful creature, he fastened a gigantic set to the four corners of creation, north, south, east, and west. Then he pierced the heart of the dragon with his lance and cut the beast in two. Of one half he made the roof of heaven, and of the other half the earth. Heaven he inlaid with the sun, moon, and stars, and the earth he covered with plants and animals. Finally, he made the first man and woman out of clay and celestial blood. The Babylonians divided history into two great periods, before the flood and after. Theirs was a land of floods, low and bordering on great rivers flowing into the sea. Just what happened to it on the occasion of the story deluge may be known pretty well by a account occurrence of the same kind so short a time ago as the year 1876. In that year, a tornado gathered in the Bay of Bengal, and amid the crash of thunder and violence so terrific as to dismast a ship distanced nearly 200 miles, approached the delta of the Ganges, met the ebbing tide and engulfing it in its own huge tidal wave, hurried an ocean of water over 140 square leagues to a depth of 45 feet, drowning 215,000 human beings and losing its strength only when it broke against the foothills of the mountains far beyond. A book found in the library of Sardanapalus at Nineveh, written on clay tablets about 2000 BC, gives a description of the deluge which closely corresponds to the above. The sea plays the principal part in it, and the ark is cast back upon a spur of the mountain. Noah, in this case, is called Zithros, Zithuros, and is stated to have received from the god of the watery deep a command to build a ship of a certain pattern dimensions, to coat it with pitch, and to put his family aboard, with the seeds of all living things. He enters the vessel, closes the door, and the craft goes adrift on the waves. On the seventh day he releases a dove, which flying hitherto and yon, and finding no resting place returns. Then a swallow is sent forth, with like result, and finally a raven, which does not come back. Zythuro, Zithros, Noah, thereupon abandons the vessel and offers sacrifices on the summit of the mountain. It is easy to understand that this story must have traveled to Canaan long before the Israelites settled in that country. Canaan was a Babylonian domain, and we find Ezekiel, the Jewish king, paying tribute to the Syrian monarch Sina, Sennacherib at a town called Lasash in southern Palestine. Curiously enough, a sculptured bas relief on Sargon's palace in Nineveh, which has been dug up, shows Zayaca in the act of doing this very thing. Sennacherib being enthroned before a tent. An accompanying inscription in uniform characters identifies the personages concerned. The question still remains: from what source did the prehistoric Mayans of the Yucatan obtain their ideas for the construction of temple-crowned pyramids? Inasmuch as these people certainly did not originate in America, they must have brought their notions of architecture from somewhere else. There are many well-known reasons for believing they were Asiatic by origin. Such being the case, this closely similarity of their pyramids to those of ancient Babylonian would seem obviously to indicate Assyrian as the earlier home of the race. Furthermore, they had, and their descendants today still possess traditions of a deluge and a Tower of Babel, the story of the tower being substantially the same as that which comes down to us in the Bible. So, yeah, couldn't think of a better introduction to the series here. And we're going to get into a post I made from quite some time ago. Excuse me. Sorry, just pulling this up here real quick. What is going on here? There we go. All right. It's showing. Perfect. Okay, so I made this post 3 years ago, and 13th Monkey, one of my first videos ever on this channel. Um, we were just poking around on Google Earth like we do, like we used to do far more often. And I came across this reservoir in Quebec. Um, and it led us down quite an interesting rabbit hole. And after studying this for quite a few days and exploring Google Earth, um, you know, architecturally, I was quite obsessed with dams and river control and so on and so forth. But the shape was obviously very interesting. The sheer size of this dam. There's so many anomalies in this region. Again, this is called the Eye of Quebec. Maybe we'll hop on Google Earth here when we wrap this up. But yeah, you can see here the dam fills this. You know, it's quite interesting. You have the lightning bolt and the alchemic in Quebec, the alchemical expression of Q is the quintessence and the ether and towers and electromagnetics and all these things kind of correspond quite nicely. Not to mention you're damming the water and harvesting the power. It's quite interesting. So the mainstream narrative is that a 3.1 mile wide asteroid hit this island and caused this island, hit the land and caused this island. In the very center of this island, the highest peak is called Mount Babel. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. Um, Further on the eye, it was also called the Cup, which is fantastic. So the Aboriginal people called it the Cup. Um, The Manicouagan crater, located in Canada's province of Quebec, is one of the Earth's oldest and most visible impact craters. Manicouagan crater was formed by an asteroid strike over 214 million years ago. Like a pebble creating ripples when dropped into water, the crater has concentric rings formed by shock waves transmitted by impact. The most prominent feature of the crater is 70-kilometer, 40-mile diameter inner ring. The total diameter of the concentric rings is 100 kilometers, 60 miles across. Um, this vivid satellite image shows the Eye of Quebec, the Earth's oldest and most visible impact craters. Yes, you can see this from space. Here, I just lightly touch on um, the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada and how they're showing this area, but it being covered in ice. It's quite interesting. Um, I've talked about the lakes, the concentric lakes you find in parts of Michigan, the central part of America, as well as Southern Virginia, North and South Carolina. And that it seems like an asteroid broke up somewhere over Indiana, Ohio, in that region, and then rained down very large chunks. Anyways, no coincidence, I don't think, that they're choosing to highlight this region and it's being covered in ice. Here's something I wanted to highlight: the Manicouagan impact crater impact melt cliff on the inner plateau of the central peak island. The impact melt cliffs found in the central region area of the Manicouagan impact crater is composed of target rock that was made temporarily molten from the energy released during impact. There are not any detectable meteorite components in the Manicouagan structure melt rock. I've hinted in the past about the relation between this and the Tower of Babel being, you know, an antenna, and that perhaps it was struck by lightning. When you have very, very large electromagnetic discharge, I mean, trillions of volts, you get quite interesting ripples, and you get, you know, large divots created, similar to like a tree. And, could this be a world tree of some kind? I don't know, but it's very interesting. So here I get into a little bit of the history of the people who inhabited this. Remember, I told you the quote aboriginals of this area in Quebec called this the cup, the sacred cup. The Innu were historically allied with neighboring Atacamawic, Maliset, and Algonquin against their enemies, the Algonquin speaking Micmac and Iroquois nations. The Iroquois repeatedly invaded their territories from near the Great Lakes and blah, 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 blah. We want to get to the point where. So, Ainu, this correlates quite endlessly with some of the Babylonian names. Um, yeah, in Canada. Why that correlation is not coincidental at all. The Skraeling is the name the Norse Greenlanders used for the peoples they encountered in North America and Greenland. In surviving source, it is first applied to the Thule people, the pro-Inuit group whom the Norse coexisted in Greenland after the 13th century. In the sagas, it is also used for the people of the region known as Vinland, whom the Norse encountered during their expeditions there in the early 11th century. I've talked a lot about Vinland and Norumbega and the castle of Norumbega in the region of perhaps Virginia and upwards. Not exactly sure. There are people that postulate a lot of different things. Um, Perhaps I'll do a video just on Norumbega in the future. But isn't it funny that we have the Norse, the Vikings, right? The Finns discussing that the people they encountered that they allied with were called the Thule people, Skraeling, in the region known as Vinland. Well, on old maps, Finland, right, extends all the way into Florida. I don't think that's a coincidence either, right? We have these kind of mix-ups of biblical peoples and all these different names applied to them, but they continually find each other. And the correlations between Micmac and Egyptian, let's just not even get into that, but it's quite endless. I go on here further. Okay, we wrap it up here. After the French Revolution, okay, so at 1793, the trial, blah, 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 creation of the revolution, supporting the arrest of the Girondins. Um, so what I show correlations between the French Revolution and this gentleman here, Georges Danton. And I've spoke openly in the past about what symbolically is going on in this image here. I've shared this before. But here you have that gentleman, right, who went to war with the man who supposedly, right, this gentleman here, whose name is written on the mountain, the Tower of Babel. And I just, following the rabbit hole where it led me, and eventually it led me to this image. And here's this gentleman here who was part of this French Revolution, right? And the chief force in the overthrow of the French monarchy and the establishment of the first French Republic. Quite a horrible, evil dude. Um, and I found so many overlays with the Napoleon narratives, the Louisiana Purchase. Who were the French in Middle America in the 1700s? Who are the French of today? I've stated also that France and French and the French language is a toddler language. It's a it's a new language to what we call France. In fact, it was one of the aristocratic languages. It was only spoken by 1 to 2% of the populace. So why I mention this is the symbology in this here, and why this gentleman, the Frisian caps, and these secret societies, and what's going on here with Medusa letting the serpents out of the underground here, and you have the eagle, the eye in the sky, you have the mummy wrapped hand holding the scepter, the eye, the tower, the lightning storm, the bats and the serpents, electromagnetic phenomenon. Make of that what you will, but um, I want to shout out somebody here, UBTV. Um, I was by a follower of mine, no joke, like right around the same time I made this post. UBTV came out with a video called "Tower of Babylon Found in America," and he's describing the exact same region. This is totally by coincidence. In fact, this was the first video and the first time I ever found his channel was one of my followers sharing this video with me. And, for the sake of copyright and respecting his material, all I'm going to do is put a link in the description. This video is absolutely worth every second of your time, and I strongly recommend it. And he makes a lot of the same correlations I do. One need only look through my videos here, and the one I'm going to reference most particularly is going to be What Lies Beneath Tennessee. And is Mississippi the oldest river on earth? And Mississippi River is the true Nile. Again, there are hints to this in every one of my Anomalous America episodes as well. But again, UBTV deserves a big shout out because he goes into unbelievable detail about this same area. And made my hair stand up when I saw this video. I couldn't believe that someone else was finding the same things at the same time. So yeah, this is where I'll stop. Um, I think I'm happy with that being kind of an introductory episode to this continuation of the Lemuria, ancient Egypt. America is the old world, is Egypt, um, and how I can wrap all the kind of Romane, Etruscan, Aztec, Mayan, Queen Mu, Lemuria, Atlantis into one big conglomerate, so to say, and that. I think part of the confusion of all these cultures is the dispensation and the scattering and the languages and bringing it all back to you know one group and one society, so to say. But yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this episode. Let me know what you think. I know I've been putting out tons of different subjects, all worthy of 2 or 3 or more episodes, but this one will be a series. So stay tuned. And as always, thanks for being here, guys. Have a great day.